Welcome to the UK column. Today I'm joined by Chris Williamson, former Labour Party MP, colleague of Jeremy Corbyn, and long-time anti-war campaigner. Welcome to the programme. Chris, how are you doing?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, not too bad at all. Thanks very much indeed. I've just been blowing the leaves off the drive. We're inundated. It's nice to have the trees around us, but in the autumn time, it's a bit of a nightmare.
Yes.
I've been spending an hour trying to clear leaves off the drive, but there we are.
Okay, well, good. Now you were in London over the weekend, of course, for the demonstration, this had the potential to be a problematic day for the reasons that we've discussed on the UK column news. But first of all, how was the demonstration itself from the Palestinian side?
Well, it was an unprecedented turnout, wasn't it? I mean, we've heard various estimates as to the number of people who attended, but it certainly felt like the biggest demonstration that I've ever been involved with. And I think it's certainly the largest expression of support for the Palestinian people in the history, actually, of demonstrations on this topic. So it went off, from my perspective, incredibly well. I was there with the Workers' Party. We had an impromptu stand and we made speeches from there, which were well received. But the feeling, I think, of solidarity with the Palestinian people was incredibly strong, and as I say, the numbers were enormous.
Brian and I were at the event the previous Saturday, and despite the headlines in the mainstream press, the point that we were trying to make following that was that, in fact, the main concern of people that were there was that there should be a ceasefire. And certainly even the BBC was having to acknowledge that the main chanting that was going on was ceasefire now. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, look, people are horrified by the fact that a genocide is taking place, and it's being perpetrated by a British ally, and the political class in this country are doing nothing about it. And they could be stressing the importance of a ceasefire. They could be using their influence on the UN Security Council, but far from doing that, they've actually used their ability to veto the resolution that was put forward to the UN Security Council to call for a ceasefire. And so there's never been, I think, a bigger disconnect between the political class across the political spectrum, Labour to Conservative. Never been a bigger disconnect between those politicians sitting in the Houses of Parliament and the people at large. In the very week that the UK used its veto alongside the United States of America to stop that resolution calling for a ceasefire, a poll was undertaken which suggested that 76% of the public wanted to see a ceasefire. And I suspect that figure has only increased in the intervening period. I mean, how could anybody actually, in all consciousness, be against a ceasefire when we're seeing the horrific images on a daily basis, hospitals being bombed, bakeries being shelled, missiles being fired at schools, and indeed even people who were following Israeli instructions to move south were then being strafed and missiles being fired at them on the road. Even a medical convoy with sick and injured people was attacked by the Zionist entity. I mean, it's an absolutely shocking and appalling state of affairs. And frankly, in my opinion, and I've made this very clear on a number of occasions, that Israel has forfeited the right to exist, actually. I mean, this is an entity which has engaged in terrorism and oppression ever since it was created in 1948. And it was created on the back of expelling 750,000 Palestinian people. Many others were massacred, and then they expanded their territory in 1967, and they've continued the illegal occupations and evictions of Palestinian people from their homes ever since. They're in breach of numerous international laws which have been passed and resolutions against them, but they just seem to just carry on with impunity. But that, I think, is because they're given a free pass by the United States and indeed by the United Kingdom. Frankly, the Western world, or the leaders of the Western world anyway, are absolutely complicit in this genocide. And, they've really shamed themselves. That's, right across Europe, United Kingdom, and the United States as well.
For me, there's a hypocrisy in this because the UK, the US, the EU have been very, very clear that in their view, the behavior of Russia in Ukraine justifies sanctions, it justifies criticism, and so on, and their demands for Russia to end its action in Ukraine, its intervention in Ukraine. And yet there's, as you say, silence on what Israel is doing in Gaza and in the West Bank, for that matter. I saw a video clip of Ursula von der Leyen being harangued in the European Parliament on this basis, and really that was a fairly justified position, it seems to me. I mean, but I think of concern is the fact that it doesn't seem to matter which side of the political spectrum you're on in the UK at the moment. The political leadership is determined to support Israel in what it's doing.
Yes, indeed. As I was just saying, I mean, the blank check that they've given to the Israeli regime, I mean, it's quite despicable, frankly. And, you talk about hypocrisy, breathtaking hypocrisy, no question about that. I mean, the double standards that they are applying when we're talking about the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Gaza. I mean, it couldn't be starker. And frankly, I mean, my position in relation to Ukraine anyway is that this is a NATO proxy war, and indeed Russia had a much stronger arguable case for intervening under the duty to protect, a kind of UN protocol, responsibility to protect the citizens of Donbass who had been attacked for the previous 8 years after the US and the United Kingdom and the EU backed a coup in Kiev and installed a puppet regime, and then they almost immediately banned the Russian language in a country where 1 in 3 people Russian is their first language, and basically started a civil war, and 14,000 people perished in that intervening period, and Zelensky's troops were massing on the border of Donbass for a major offensive, led by, let's remember, literal Nazis in the Azov battalion. Just before the Russian special military operation occurred. NATO completely spurned the attempt that Russia made in December of 2021, where they put forward a peace and security proposal to ensure that peace and security in Europe was maintained. And they just didn't even give it the time of day, didn't just dismissed it out of hand. And, over a long period of time, Russia had made it very clear that Ukraine becoming a member of NATO was an absolute red line. And let's also remember that the US pledged to Mikhail Gorbachev, if he agreed to German reunification, that the NATO would not expand 1 inch, was the precise terminology that they used, would not expand 1 inch eastward, beyond the German border, and yet it virtually doubled in size. So I think there are two very different conflicts going on. But the hypocrisy, having said that, of course, where, as you say, imposing sanctions and giving untold support, military support, financial support, support in terms of accepting refugees fleeing the hostilities in Ukraine, compared to what we're seeing in Gaza right now. And of course, let's remember what's happening in the West Bank as well. I mean, I think the last figure I saw was about 170 or so Palestinians, nothing in the scale, of course, but, nevertheless, 170 odd Palestinians have perished at the hands of the military, the Israeli military, and of course the very aggressive illegal settlers there, the Israeli settlers who have been engaging in pogroms against the Palestinian people, beatings and daily humiliations. We've even seen situations, haven't we, where Palestinians who'd been killed by either Israeli military or settlers, I'm not sure whom, but anyway, then we saw them urinating on the dead bodies. I mean, it's absolutely shocking behaviour, and all sorts of other humiliations of being inflicted on the Palestinian people right across the West Bank, and of course, what we're seeing in Gaza right now is this shocking and dreadful genocide. And that's why I say Israel's forfeited the right to exist. It's this disregarded international law. It's disregarded all norms of humanity and decency. It's engaged in a genocide. It's the worst form of apartheid. And this is not simply me saying that. This is ANC veterans, people as esteemed as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said that the apartheid regime in Palestine, Israel, is considerably worse than anything that they had to contend with in South Africa. And the world turned on South Africa, and ultimately with the pressure from within, the effectiveness of the ANC, the African National Congress, and the pressure from that without, with sanctions and so on and so forth. Ultimately, that regime was toppled, and that's what we need to see with the situation in Palestine, Israel right now, because this is an unsustainable situation. And there is a massive disconnect. We've made this point already. It's worth re-emphasizing, though. There's a massive disconnect between the political clash right across Europe, right across the United Kingdom, and indeed in the United States of America, between the political leaders and the public. The public at large are absolutely horrified and are overwhelmingly in support of the Palestinian people, although you wouldn't know that if you read or relied on the corporate media. And then if you then look at the rest of the world, particularly in the global south, the support is absolutely phenomenal. And we're also seeing steps being taken now with nations like Bolivia, South Africa, I think, has announced this as well, withdrawing their ambassadors, their diplomats, and they're breaking off diplomatic relations with Israel. It has to be isolated. This regime has to fall. This whole system has to be dismantled, and a completely new entity has to be brought in, it seems to me, to take its place.
Okay, I'd like to have a look, discuss with you a little bit some of the events in the UK over the last couple of weeks. We have seen the ramping up of tension around Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday with respect to the Armistice Day in particular and the march on Saturday. It seemed to me that tension was being ramped up, not by the usual, including the usual voices on Twitter and so on, but actually by the mainstream press and by mainstream politicians. Of course, Suella Braverman being one of them, and of course she's lost her job this morning. But yes. It seemed to me that there has been a concerted effort to build a narrative in the UK of a burgeoning far right and the facing off of this far right with the left in politics is something that has been a narrative that's been building. And I just wanted to get your comments on what you think, or whether Suella Braverman absolutely crossed a line or not in what she did over the last couple of weeks, and whether the mainstream press is complicit in that.
Oh, most certainly. I think that's unquestionably. It's pretty clear that she crossed the line, even for Rishi Sunak, who's given his unqualified support to the Israeli regime when she wrote that inflammatory article. I think it was in the Times newspaper, and I think that there was a pressure applied to her to tone it down, and she refused to do so. Utterly irresponsible, it seems to me, what we've seen from the likes of Suella Braverman. And the mainstream media, they've really kind of been building this up into something which, could lead to very serious violence. I mean, there were some confrontations with far-right extremists on Saturday, very limited. I didn't actually see any myself, but I have seen some video footage of them taking place. And I think Tommy Robinson's Confederates were attempting, I don't quite know what they were planning to do, but trying to storm the cenotaph. And all the nonsense which was fed into the media and the way in which the media, portrayed this whole narrative that somehow this was, disrespectful, and that somehow, this were, there would be groups of Palestinian campaigners going and sort of desecrating the cenotaph. Complete nonsense. That was never, in my opinion, ever going to happen. But look, I mean, to suggest in some way that marching for a ceasefire in support of an oppressed people was in some way offensive to and disrespectful to the Armistice Day, and disrespectful to the memory of people served and lost their lives in two world wars and other conflicts thereafter. In some way that was disrespectful is absolute nonsense. I mean, my opinion was, and what I made very clear publicly, was that there's never actually a more appropriate day to march for a ceasefire than on Armistice Day, because what is the very definition of armistice? It's basically to call for a ceasefire. It's when when hostilities came to an end in the First World War. That's what it commemorates. And surely there is no more appropriate thing to do, therefore, than to actually march for a ceasefire on Armistice Day. Goodness me. I mean, talk about, 1984 sort of propaganda. This is just absurd. And the way that was used to, as I say, try and, whip up emotions. And it did lead, I think, to, as a consequence of that, to these, albeit thankfully limited, violent occurrences. But there's been other examples, haven't there, where, you've got the police been arresting people for having a Palestinian flag. People have been thrown out of football grounds for wearing a Palestinian T-shirt. Police have even visited people's own home when they've had a Palestinian flag in the window. What on earth are we doing when, a country that used to pride itself on free speech is, using the instruments of the state to clamp down on people who are standing up for an oppressed, people. I can't get my head around it. Where are we going? This is like some sort of tin pot dictatorship, and we absolutely, it seems to me, have to, resist this. And one of the things I was calling for on the weekend in my impromptu speech as the marchers were going by is that, ultimately we will need a mass campaign of civil disobedience. This cannot be allowed to stand, this direction of travel that we're seeing our political class and indeed supported, aided and abetted by the corporate media. This cannot be allowed. This is Britain, and we must not tolerate it. And that's why I think, it's important that we do stand in solidarity, with each other and together with the Palestinian people. And as far as football supporters are concerned, I've said this publicly as well. We need to be, taking a leaf out of the book of the Celtic fans who show their unqualified support for, the Palestinian people with an absolute, mass of Palestinian flags at their football games. That's the way to go, it seems to me, because this is a appalling tragedy that is happening in real time, and our politicians have the ability, have the power to end it, and they're not doing anything to actually bring that about.
It's interesting you say that. How do we? Because clearly this issue is extremely divisive, and so how do we get people to focus on the human tragedy of what's going on, rather than the whatever their particular ideology might be?
Well, I mean, you say it's divisive, and I think that it has created division. However, the overwhelming majority, in my opinion, of people do see the reality of the situation and are increasingly expressing their solidarity and support for the Palestinian people. And that was obviously evidenced by the number of people that turned out on the street in London at the weekend. It's also been evidenced by the numbers of people who have been expressing solidarity through rallies and marches in towns and cities all over the country. And I think what we need to therefore do is kind of build on that, acknowledge that, celebrate that, but also ensure that we are spreading the reality of what is happening on the ground. And there's plenty of evidence for what is happening on the ground, thanks to platforms like yours, of course, but other independent platforms and social media in general, where people are recording the absolute horror that is being visited on the Palestinian people, thanks to the advent of smartphones and so on. They're uploading this onto the internet, although obviously the Israeli regime has done its best to limit the ability to access the internet. But those images are still coming out. People are seeing the reality of it, seeing the hospitals being attacked, the schools being attacked, the numbers of children being killed, the horrendous, appalling injuries that are happening on a daily basis. And I think the more people see the reality, the more people will come to realize that this has got to stop. It's got to come to an end, and they need to be supporting the Palestinian people. They need to be getting behind the calls for a ceasefire, and ultimately, I hope, getting behind the calls for the dismantling of the Israeli regime. The Israel project needs to end, because it's absolutely demonstrated that it is a rogue state that is guilty of committing the most horrendous crimes against humanity.
I can accept your point about the horrendous crimes against humanity. Absolutely with you 100% on that. My question is, um, if we're talking about taking it further than just a change of the regime in Israel, if you're talking about dismantling the whole country, what do you think replaces it, or what can replace it, and what happens to the people that are there?
A single state with equal rights for everybody. I mean, we've got a situation where there's apartheid in the country. I mean, most Palestinian people, can't vote. I mean, in Israeli elections, we have a system of, as I've said, apartheid. But certain roads only Jews are allowed to drive on those roads, or Israeli citizens anyway. The people living in the West Bank, etc., are stopped from doing so. I was talking to some Palestinians who live in the West Bank just yesterday, in fact, and they were telling me about some of the daily indignities and inconveniences that are they have to contend with. And potential risks that they are facing on a daily basis. So yes, well, that's the way to go, I think. I think in any event, Israel is imploding. Prior to the latest Palestinian uprising, there was a poll for Channel 13, an Israeli TV channel, that suggested that 28% of the Israeli population were considering leaving the country. That number was massively increased. I'm not seeing any figures, but it must have massively increased since the latest uprising and the conflict which has happened since that time. Over the intervening last 4 weeks or so, the Israeli people will no longer, I think, or many of them anyway, feel safer. The likes of Netanyahu say, Jews should come to Israel because that's the only place that they're safe. Well, clearly that isn't the case, is it? So, I think there's pressure from within. The economy is struggling now as well. There's definitely pressure building from without, and the resistance on the ground, of course, is also considerably better organised and better equipped than it's ever been. And they're never going to destroy Hamas. That is an impossibility. In fact, if anything, they've strengthened the cause of the resistance, which isn't just Hamas anyway. It's all of the resistance factions are collaborating together. You don't defeat an ideal by violence. All that does is it acts as a recruiting sergeant. And just think of all those children that have been killed. Think of all those children that have been orphaned, and the resentment that will inevitably create. And more and more people, I think, will be radicalized by the Israelis' actions rather than do anything to quell the resistance to what is an unjust system. I very much believe in Martin Luther King Jr.'s maxim when he said, that the arc of human justice is long, but in the end, the arc of human. My goodness, I forgot the quote now. But basically, he said, in the end, it bends towards justice, and I think ultimately the Palestinian people will get justice because their cause is a right cause, and we have to support them in that endeavour.
I absolutely take your point. I've heard this from other people as well about a single state with equal rights for all. This seems like an excellent suggestion. The difficulty I have with it is that there doesn't seem to be any support for that in the international community. So China, Russia, for example, are talking about a two-state solution. So how does the idea of a single state get some traction without the support of the likes of Russia, China, and other international interests?
Well, I think for the reasons I've already outlined, that Israel is beginning to implode in any event. There's a lot of opposition to the Israeli regime from its own population, and many people are leaving. Many people are dual citizens, so they're leaving the country in any event. So just the ability for it to continue and function as a state is going to be problematic for them. There is a very strong resistance faction on the ground now, which is creating huge, enormous problems, headaches for the Israeli regime. And I think that given what people have seen, these horrors that have been visited on the Palestinian people, that the political class ultimately, I think, will have to acknowledge that this can't go on, and that their people, won't tolerate that. The electorate, I think, will push for, people who want to see peace around the world. And a lot of the problems that we have in the world, can be traced back to the turmoil in the Middle East, and the need for a different system to be put in place. I think will be something that increasing numbers of people recognise, and I think that the politicians will be forced, kicking and screaming, actually, to, if need be, to push for an alternative. But look, at one point in time, the South African regime seemed to be impervious to change. Nelson Mandela jailed for all those years. The likelihood of any change seemed impossible. They were supported by and aided and abetted by the very self-same players which are supporting and aiding and abetting the Israeli regime today. But ultimately, things changed, and changed from the bottom, I think, to a large extent because of pressure from below, from huge campaigns. And I hope and believe that is something that we can bring about, with regard to situation as far as Israel is concerned. Look, obviously, the getting a ceasefire is the first thing that's needed, but if that's all that happens, then the apartheid system remains in place, and nothing really substantially changes. And that is an unsustainable situation, particularly when you've got, these illegal settlements with the settlers who are incredibly violent and effectively mounting regular pogroms against the Palestinian people. The house demolitions, the occupations, the way in which people are evicted from their homes and then replaced with new settlers. That's all going to continue if all we get is a ceasefire. Ceasefire is the first and most pressing thing, of course, that we need to push for. But ultimately, we need a more sustainable system to be implemented there, which delivers the equal rights that I think everybody who, with a fair mind and an open heart, would want to see and believe should be a basic human right.
So the question then is, do you think if the internal pressures are, as they seem to be in Israel, if the support of the UK, the US, and the EU was withdrawn, perhaps that regime may fall?
Yeah, without the support of the United States of America and the blank check that they're given from the likes of the United Kingdom and the European Union, clearly Israel wouldn't be able to sustain itself. They receive nearly $4 billion a year in subsidies from the United States of America, and the House of Representatives, I think it was last week, voted to give them, I think it was a £14 billion additional slug of dollars, should we say, a slug of money. But yeah, and obviously they sold arms and so on. They did lots of collaboration certainly with the United Kingdom on a range of different areas of the economy. So without that support, if they were isolated in that way, then of course they wouldn't be able to sustain themselves. No doubt in my mind about that. And that's why we need to be bringing pressure on the political class to take these appropriate moral steps to bring that pressure on the Israeli regime to bring about a fair settlement.
So the issue here is, of course, that there is no political opposition to what Israel's doing on any side of the House at the moment. So really, it's up to the voter to suggest to Keir Starmer that if he really wants to be in government next time round, he needs to come back onto an anti-war footing, as perhaps the Labour Party has represented in the past?
Well, I think that's, yes, ideally, but I think that's highly unlikely because Keir Starmer's made it clear that he supports Zionism without qualification. So the chances of the Labour Party being the vehicle, I think, are very limited, indeed almost sort of impossible to see that happening now. There's apparently a motion before the House of Commons on Wednesday, an SNP motion has been put down calling for an immediate ceasefire, and I'm told that in fact it's been reported that the Labour whips are instructing Labour MPs to vote against it. So, the chances of Labour, I mean, I think it's going to probably require some sort of new electoral vehicle, which, is obviously not easy, but, is something that we have to strive for. And, because as I say, I mean, just that Martin Luther King quote has come back to me: the arc of the moral universe is long, but in the end it bends towards justice. And part of delivering that justice, I think, will be, a new political settlement probably in this country and, in other nations around the world, to ensure that, we get politicians in power who actually, believe in peace and use their position to deliver that, to deliver a kind of fairer world. I mean, this is, of course, one of the things that Jeremy Corbyn was targeted for, because, he was somebody who was promoting peace and disarmament and appointed a shadow minister for peace and disarmament. And, we had Labour won the election, we would have had a permanent seat, as you know, on the UN Security Council promoting peace and disarmament around the world instead of war and arms sales. And that was, of course, unconscionable to the military-industrial complex. And that was one of the many vested interests that were determined to ensure that a prime minister, wouldn't come to power who was in favour of peace and disarmament, and in favour of an equitable settlement in Palestine, where Palestinian people were treated with respect, and that Israel would be called out by a very influential politician. If the United States of America are Israel's number one ally, well, Britain is certainly very close behind, and that's why he came under such enormous pressure, amongst many other things as well, of course. But I think that was the thing that did him more damage than almost anything else.
I'd just like to touch, if we could, on the interview that you had with Julia Hartley-Brewer last week, because we were talking earlier on in the interview with about the mainstream media ramping up tensions between the various opinions around this topic, but what she seemed to be expressing was real anger. Do you think that was real, or was it something that was a bit of an act?
I don't know whether it was confected or whether it was real. I mean, she certainly plays to a certain demographic, I think, in society, and she's part of the irresponsible, journalistic class, if you like, that were, ramping up those tensions. And people like her find it impossible to tolerate anybody who is speaking against the received wisdom, the received narrative that the mainstream media, the corporate media, has been promulgating in relation to the situation in Gaza. It's all about Hamas are evil, savage terrorists. But when we now know, and more information has come out about what happened on October the 7th, that many, if not most, of the people who died on that day were killed by, if you like, so-called friendly fire, but killed by the Israeli occupation forces. The people who were killed in the buildings on the kibbutz were killed by tank shells. We know that Hamas didn't have any tanks. They haven't got any tanks at all. They certainly didn't have any tanks on that day. And the people who were killed in the cars, they were victims of missile strikes from Apache helicopters, and many of the other people were killed in crossfire because there were Israeli occupation forces at that location, and they opened fire, and many people were killed in the crossfire. Now, that isn't just Hamas propaganda. That is something which is being reported in the Israeli media. It's rather ironic, actually. You get a more accurate picture from the Israeli media about what is happening than we do in the British corporate media. And people like Julia Hartley-Brewer don't seem to be willing to listen to an alternative to the reality about what's happening. I mean, and this notion that somehow Hamas are beyond the pale ignores the fact that, I mean, I think it was 2017, they accepted a two-state solution. I mean, it's more moderate than what I've just been saying. They accepted a two-state solution within the pre-1967 borders. They said they wouldn't recognize Israel, but they would accept that two-state solution. But to listen to the likes of Julia Hartley-Brewer, I mean, that or indeed any media. I don't think I've heard any media actually making that clear that is the reality of the situation. And nor have they spoken about the so-called Hannibal Directive, which is an official protocol that's been adopted by the Israeli military, whereby they, if necessary, will kill their own people in order to stop people being taken prisoner, being taken hostage. And it seems to me, it looks like anyway, that the Hannibal Directive was implemented on October the 7th. And so I think it's important, that we talk about these realities. And it's helpful that the Israeli media are actually reporting on these facts. And the more I think that people hear the reality of the situation, the more they come to the view that the situation is unsustainable and that the genocide has to come to an end, and that a new settlement has to be put into place to replace the present unsustainable situation, which is a stain on humanity.
I just want to ask you about the potential of this escalating regionally and obviously internationally. Here in the UK, Suella Braverman has gone as Home Secretary. James Cleverly has been moved across to that role. We don't know who the new Foreign Secretary is going to be, but the rumour is it might be David Cameron. I'm not seeing anybody being placed in positions or names being suggested who may want to calm this down. And of course, with more and more Western military presence, whether it be naval or whatever, in the region, this has the potential to escalate, it seems to me, quite significantly. I mean, what are your thoughts on this and how do we prevent it?
Well, it certainly does have the potential to expand to a wider conflagration. Indeed, has the potential to spark a third world war, with the United States sailing its ships into the Mediterranean, its aircraft carriers and so on. The potential, I think, for other players to become involved, I think, is still real. Hezbollah, already there's been some skirmishes there. They could indeed become involved. Iran potentially could become involved. That could precipitate, response to the United States of America. So it's a very dangerous situation at the moment. And what can we do to stop that? I mean, I think we just need to, difficult, obviously, because we haven't got the hands on levers of power, but we just need to grow the resistance to it. We need to grow the opposition to it through these marches, through the pressure that we have to bring to bear on the political leaders to demand that wiser heads must prevail. I hope and pray that will bring about the sort of calmer situation that we desperately need. And of course, what we're seeing as well, which I've already mentioned, a number of countries, outside the Western world are withdrawing diplomatic relations with Israel, and let's just hope that the pressure that's building within these countries and what we're seeing elsewhere in the world will prevent any escalation being brought about as a result of the Western powers getting involved. But the chances of wider conflagration are occurring are still very high, it seems to me.
Iran has clearly been a target of Western policy for quite a long time now. Do you see there's a danger of people using this as an excuse?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. They've certainly been pushing. I mean, Iran is probably the most sanctioned country in the world, but it's found ways of getting around that, and it's thrived despite the efforts of the United States of America and the West to crush it. It's now joined in the BRICS, and that we are moving towards a multipolar world now, aren't we? And Iran is a significant player. I hope that the United States won't risk a war with Iran, because this could be really devastating, and as I said, have much wider implications. But yes, they're definitely looking to, or some of the hawks anyway, looking for an excuse to mount an attack on Iran. But it obviously will. I mean, thankfully, nothing of that magnitude has occurred yet, and all we can do is what we have been trying to do in terms of raising political consciousness, bringing pressure on the politicians, pushing back against the mainstream narrative in the media. And we are succeeding on that front anyway. Despite the best endeavours of the corporate media to spin a yarn, the people are not being convinced by it. And we have an election next year in Britain, and there's a potential that there may be some breakthroughs, and we get some people elected anyway who with a genuine sort of anti-imperialist, pro-peace stance that would have that political platform to push that agenda. But it's very dangerous times. There's no doubt about that. We've got sociopaths who, regrettably, are in the ascendancy in the political class. But at least a sensible step has been taken in sacking Suella Braverman for her, dangerous split talk that she's been engaged in. That's perhaps a hopeful sign that Britain at least will, not go where some of the hawks would like to see us going.
Okay, and just finally then, Chris, would be interested to get your thoughts on how or what kind of message needs to go out to the people that are absolutely determined that Israel has the right to defend itself, no matter how that right is expressed. What can be said to people with that viewpoint to convince them to join the call for a ceasefire?
Well, in the words of John Lennon, give peace a chance. This isn't self-defense. This is genocide. What they're doing in Gaza, what they're doing in the West Bank is totally unjustified, and certainly not justified by the reality of what happened on the ground on October the 7th, which a number of the survivors have given eyewitness accounts of the reality there. So this is a totally disproportionate response. It's an unsustainable response. It's an immoral response. The right to self-defense does not give Israel the right to murder children in their thousands, to attack hospitals, schools, bakeries, to cut off water, to cut off energy and food. I mean, this is a medieval siege situation that we are witnessing. And, that's not self-defense. That is, as we keep saying, that is genocide. And that is utterly unjustifiable and is, a million miles from self-defense.
Chris Williamson, thank you very much for joining us today. Is there anything else you would like to add just to end?
No, I mean, just to encourage people to, join in the calls on our politicians to put pressure on Israel, join the marches calling for peace and the ceasefire, and, use the opportunity. Most MPs have regular surgeries. Go and see your member of parliament and express your horror about what is happening, and demand that they, stand up for peace. They stand up for the interest of Great Britain, because it's certainly not in the interest of Great Britain for this situation to continue, because, as we've just said, it could result in the potentiality of a third world war. And that's obviously in nobody's interest. And the last thing we want to see in this country, is war being brought to our shore. So, I think this is, an urgent situation that people use their effort to use their democratic rights to, pressurize our politicians to do the right thing.
Chris Williamson, thank you very much for joining me today. We'll hope to speak again soon. Thank you.